without having to use a phone. So, our reading this morning comes from Daniel chapter 3, verses 10 through 20. Before I read it, I want to set it up because this is the period after three guys with very interesting names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had pleased King Nebuchadnezzar so much that they had received positions of authority and had been granted sort of their heart's desires. And there were some people who weren't real enthused with the fact that these guys were being blessed and by the king, so they came up with a way to get back at him. And the way they did that was they got Nebuchadnezzar to pass a decree saying that people had to worship idols. So we'll pick up there in chapter 3, verse 10. It says, "Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, Your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. And that's where I end the reading. The first thing I would point out is that I think God has a sense of humor because he would put the names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into that writing that many times. And he was laughing when he did it, going, let's watch people in the future. They're never going to get this out right. The topic that I chose for a sermon today comes because of a news article I read. I like to read news articles. I keep up on them at home. I get them via email. Any way I can get news, I like to get it. I like to read. I like to see what's happening in the world. I came across an article a couple of weeks ago that caught my attention. And it's really short, so I'm just going to read it. It says, a Dutch appeals court has upheld a €60, about $90, fine against an Orthodox Jew who refused to show police an identity card citing religious reasons. The Hague Appeals Court ruled that a law which makes it mandatory for all people older than 14 to carry ID cards and show them to police upon request does not have a religious exemption. The man, whose name was not released due to privacy laws, had argued it was against his religious beliefs to carry anything but his clothing on the Jewish Sabbath. Short news article. Here's a guy, he's presumably going to temple on the Sabbath to worship, and for whatever reason, he gets stopped by the police. And they say, hey, I need to see your ID card. There's a problem. He's a Hasidic Jew. He's an Orthodox Jew who holds the belief that on the Sabbath he can do no work short of going to and from temple. He can't carry an ID card in his pocket because that would violate the laws against work. Creates a bit of a quandary, doesn't it? Because the law, man's law, says you have to have that ID. Now we could sit, as Baptists and Christians, we could sit and go, it's just an ID card. Couldn't you just put it in your pocket on Friday night before the Sabbath? That way you've got it. If the police need to see it, they can reach in your pocket. You don't have to do work. They can reach in your pocket and pull the ID card out. But his laws, the laws of his religion, say no, he cannot do that. So he doesn't carry it. He gets caught. He gets fined. $100. It's not a ton, but if you think of it, every week you could get fined $100 for not carrying an ID card, you might get a little frustrated. And he appealed it, and the court said, too bad. There's nothing in there that says that because you're an Orthodox Jew, you don't have to carry it. His appeal failed, the law stands, and any Jew who doesn't carry an ID card could face this fine. But it raises some interesting questions, doesn't it? Because, you see, we know that we can be punished for God's law, and we know that we can be punished for man's law, but what about disobeying man's law because of God's law? What do we do? There's lots of stories of people being punished by man in the Bible. Okay, we read about one today. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down and worship an idol of gold. And everyone knows what happens at the end of that story, right? He heats that furnace up 7 times hotter than usual, and he has the guards chuck the 3 guys into the furnace. The fire is so hot that the guards who throw those guys into the furnace get burned up. They're dead just for throwing them in. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were held accountable and punished for their refusal to follow King Nebuchadnezzar's law. God didn't step in and say, whoa, wait, King Nebuchadnezzar, you can't do that. These guys are obeying my law, and my law is more important than your law. That didn't happen. Now, fortunately, God did protect him. God provided that as a teachable moment for Nebuchadnezzar. He said, hey, your guys are dead, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're okay. They're walking around in there. My angel is protecting them. My spirit is with them because they obeyed my law. Because my law is more important than yours. God protected the 3 of them, but they were still held accountable. We can think of other set parts in Daniel where Daniel faces the same thing. He gets thrown in with the lions for the refusal to obey the law of the land. Paul, if you've read any of Acts, if you've read the life of Paul, you know that he kept getting thrown in jail for his obedience to God and disobedience to man's law. In Acts 16, there's a story about Paul and Silas. They're being chased around by a woman. She's afflicted with an evil spirit, and it enables her to predict the future. And Paul gets so frustrated with this woman that in the name of God, he commands the spirit to leave her. Well, the command of God is powerful, and the spirit left her. But the problem was she was a slave to another group of people, and she lost the ability to earn money through her predictions. So they went and they had Paul and Silas thrown in jail because of what they'd done. Paul and Silas didn't do anything that was wrong in our eyes, and certainly not in God's eyes, but they still got to be thrown in jail because they'd done something that was wrong in the eyes of man. And if we think about Jesus at the end of his ministry, we're approaching Easter, we're approaching Good Friday, we're approaching that period where Jesus goes through his tribulation, and we know that Jesus didn't go to the cross for anything he did that was in violation of God's law. He didn't even really go for a violation of man's law. He went to prison, or he went to the cross because of what man said. So there's all these stories of people who violate man's law and they get punished for it. But what you don't see in the Bible, and trust me, I was digging through it, what you don't see in the Bible is anything that says obedience to God's law frees you from man's law. It's not there. Nowhere does the God say, hey, because you're a Christian, because you're a believer in me and support my mission, you don't have to obey the laws of man. It's not there. It doesn't exist. Really, there's four possibilities that we can come across as we think about it. The first is that God's law and man's law are simultaneous issue. They don't say anything. I really tried to think about situations where you have that, and I struggled. I couldn't. I was like, okay, well, what doesn't God tell us about that man doesn't? And I came up climbing a mountain. It's really generic. You pick anything out there, really. Racing a sports car. There's all sorts of examples of things you could do. Well, there's no law against it. God doesn't really say anything about it, and man doesn't say anything about it. Those are easy. God's law doesn't say anything. Man's law doesn't do it. Have fun, right? Nobody out there is going to condemn you for climbing a mountain, or racing a sports car, or driving or walking down the street. These are all things that are allowed. So that's kind of an easy one. We'll just bypass that. The second one that you can come across is an action that violates God's law and man's law. I think these are pretty easy too. A couple of examples that I had. One was the sixth commandment. Sixth commandment is easy, right? Deuteronomy 5:17. It's only 4 words. You shall not murder. Sixth commandment, don't kill. Can't kill. It's bad. Don't do it. And then, if you want to dig deeper, you can go into Title 18 of the United States Code. I don't remember the section 31 maybe. You go into Title 18 of the U.S. Code, and it says, murder is the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. In other words, if you think about it and do it, it's murder. So we have God's law that says thou shalt not kill. We have man's law that says killing people intentionally is murder. So you don't do it. That's easy, right? No one questions that. No challenge, right? It's easy to not go out and murder people. Do we agree? I've never had that problem. There's another one, if you go a couple, Deuteronomy 5:19 is another 4-word command. You shall not steal. Don't steal from people. And there are 28 different sections. If you go into U.S. Code, it's really long. I didn't write all of it down. There's identity theft and embezzlement and personal, theft of personal property. There's all these ideas of theft. And we don't really struggle with that. It's against the law to steal. It's against God's commands to steal. And we're able to remain obedient to it. Now you start to get into things that get a little shakier, maybe a little more difficult. But still not overly hard. Actions that violate man's law, but not God's law. Again, I really had to struggle to think, what sort of situation? I think driving laws is a good example. Drive 55 miles an hour. Don't drive under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Stop at a stop sign. God's law doesn't say a lot about that. There's nothing in the Bible that talks about, driving a vehicle. But there are lots of laws about it. The same with election laws. We just went through elections. We all know there's tons of election laws. All these different laws that man has on the books that we have to obey. How many people struggle to obey the laws of the United States? Not a lot. There's enough. There's plenty of people in jail. But for the people sitting here, we don't really struggle with this. We go out, we drive on the roads, we know that we can't, blow through a stop sign, we have to obey a yield sign, we have to drive 55 miles an hour, and we're willing to pay the fine if we don't. It's not a big deal. It's easy to do it. And the same thing, just like murder, theft, you don't struggle to follow these laws. Then we get to the fourth possibility when it comes to laws, And this is where we run into challenges. The fourth possibility for a law is something where man's law is silent. It doesn't say anything, but God's law does. These are the ones that mess us up. These are the ones that create a problem in our lives. I've listed some things here that are against God's law, but mankind doesn't seem to say a word about it. Adultery, fornication, homosexuality, lust, greed, church attendance, tithing. I had to pile them up because I ran out of room on the slide. These are all things we don't want to talk about. They're ugly words. They're things that, we can sit up there and we might look at one of those, and I could make that list 5 slides long. And we would sit, and there's one that you would go, oh, that's me, or, oh, I don't want to talk about that. Oh, this is too ugly. This is too difficult. Oh, why is he talking about that? These are the things that we struggle with following. But God's law doesn't allow any more wiggle room than man's law does. Less, in fact. God's law is clear. Leviticus 20:13. Let's see if there's any confusion here. If a man has sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They are to be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. Now we can take that and apply it to the New Testament and understand that mercy comes with sin. We're to be merciful more than condemnation or condemning. When we face sin, we're not to condemn people to death. But God has already made that condemnation. He's already provided the instruction. In John 8, verses 1 through 11, Jesus is presented with a case of adultery. We know he was presented with a case to entrap him. The Pharisees and the Sadducees wanted to catch him in some sort of a legal slip for which they could get him accused, as they did later, and have him prosecuted and him pursued for the crimes he committed. So they brought him an adulterous woman and said, hey, the law says that she's committed adultery. We should stone her. What should we do? What do you think? And Jesus had to think about it, and Jesus pointed out, mercy outweighs the punishment. The people are called to be merciful, and he had to teach them. So he chastises them. He puts them in a situation. Go ahead. Start throwing rocks. If you're without sin, start chucking stones. And they all walk away because they realize, same thing. If there's all those words up there, one of them applies to them. They can't condemn her because they're as guilty as she is. They're guilty by the very act of bringing her there because they didn't bring the guy. There were 2 people involved in that act of adultery. Only one of them got robbed. It was a trap. So Jesus watches everybody walk away and he says, okay, I don't condemn you either. But he ends with a very simple statement. He says, leave your life of sin. He didn't condone her sin. He didn't justify it or accept it. He told her it was wrong. He just said, we're going to show mercy in this case. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure. For God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. You could throw that out today. That's almost junk. I mean, as far as man and culture is concerned, that just almost doesn't even apply. Because that fornication thing that we talked about, it's still probably listed up there. That fornication thing, that's just freely accepted in today. Mankind doesn't care. Man's law doesn't say a word, and nobody else does. But as a church, how do we handle that? How do we address those things? How do we address those things that we know are against God's law when man's law remains silent? Why is it that obedience to God's law is so much more difficult than obedience to man's law? Man, the worst they can do is execute you. The worst, if you go out and commit first-degree murder, the worst that could possibly happen to you is that they could take your life in return. God, his punishments are a whole lot worse. Because God only has one punishment. God's punishment for sin is eternal death. Forget the death on, in an electric chair. God's punishment is eternal death. And that's the whole casting into the lake of fire, eternal, absence from the presence of God. Is there anybody here that would try to justify first-degree murder? If somebody walked out and said, I'm going to go kill that person because I don't like them, and they shoot them dead, there's not a single person here that would try and justify that. But we routinely justify the sins that we commit against God, and we allow and condone the sins that others can commit against God, and it's really backwards. We should remain obedient to God's law even when man laughs at us. Even when man says, wow, you're so old-fashioned. Oh, you're so lost. You're so clueless. We should be obedient to God's law. There are a lot of people who question this Hasidic Jew for his decision not to carry an ID. They laugh at him. They think it's, you should be fine. It should be $500 or $1,000. They think it's funny that he remains obedient to God's law. When they have their head on backwards, they shouldn't be questioning his following and his obedience to God's law. They should question why man's law forces us to be disobedient to God's law. They do have that authority, though. Jesus, we'll hit the passion in the next couple of weeks. Jesus, in John chapter 19, verses 8 to 11, he's in front of Pilate, and he says, when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus, but Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. Jesus knew that his conviction, and I put air quotes, conviction was fraud. It was totally unjust. It was corrupt. But he accepted that Pilate had that authority. We're covered by man's law. There's nothing we can do about it. God tells us that. The issue isn't that we should be, struggling with man's law. We should be struggling with our obedience to God's law. We have 3 weeks until Easter. Easter is a celebration of Christ dying and rising from the dead for the sins that we commit. Those sins are when we pay more attention to man and their laws than we pay to God's laws. We need to start focusing on God's law and how we violate that, because that's when we get into real trouble. We're obligated to follow man's laws. We're also obligated to follow God's law. In fact, I would say God's law has to come first. If it doesn't, then we would have been like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We would have knelt down and worshipped the idol of gold. No, I would never do that. Today we worship those idols of gold. They just take a different form. They look like green money. They look like dollar bills. They look like pornography on the internet. They look like ignoring the people in need. These are all the sins and all the idols that we worship today. We need to be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and stand up and be able to say, no, man is wrong, God is right, and I'm going to follow God. Amen.
We'd like to close, send you by singing the first 2 verses of Prayer is the Soul's Sincere Desire. It is in the hymnal if you want to do it from there, but I'm just going to forewarn you, we're going to sing a different tune than what's in the hymnal. But the words will also be on the screen. So stand and join me as we send you singing Prayer is the Soul's Sincere Desire.
Before the benediction, 2 points. One, I thank you to Holly and Lori for taking the effort to look at songs and figure out how they can be interchanged and crossed and mixed, and I would never be able to do that. And also, in making all the announcements that were pointed out today, I forgot my own announcement. In 3 weeks, we will be having an Easter breakfast. I have tickets that I've printed up just like last year for those who are interested in coming. See me afterwards. I'll be hanging around somewhere. Now, join with me in prayer. Heavenly Father, as we conclude today, we know that it's difficult to remain faithful to you and to your word. That's why Jesus had to come and die on the cross for us. Jesus demonstrated that mercy was far more powerful than condemnation, and we ask that you would be with us as we face those things both in our own lives and that we witness in others. None of us is without sin, and none of us is without the need for Christ's love and forgiveness, and he gave it so freely. As we leave this place today, I would ask that we focus on ourselves and how we can better follow your word, and on others and how we can best lead them to your word. Send us forth to do just that. In your name we pray. Amen.
Push stop.